First, to join me in welcoming Emma Eden Ramos, the author of 2 novels and 1 poetry chapbook. She is a teacher, she is an incredibly effective and articulate speaker, and she's here to talk with us about her journey. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Ramos.
First, I would like to thank Dr. Axelrod and the other directors of today's conference, Dr. Perry Hoffman, and the amazing leaders at NEABPD for inviting me to share my story this afternoon. I am deeply grateful for this opportunity. There is, as I am sure you now know, a strong connection between trauma and the development of borderline personality disorder. In one study, 52% of the participants diagnosed with BPD met full criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, while another study revealed that up to 75% of people with BPD had a history of trauma. I am here today because, unfortunately, these numbers apply to me. As a child, I experienced multiple forms of abuse from multiple abusers. For a long time, I believed that it was my fault, that I elicited abusive behaviors from the adults in my life, and that was evidence of a personal defect. I carried that belief with me into early adulthood. I have since learned that is a common false narrative among survivors. Every child deserves physical and emotional safety. That is a human right. When I was 5 years old, I was molested by a family friend. He wasn't someone I knew well or saw often, but the incident left a permanent scar on my psyche. Like many children who are violated at an age when they cannot fully articulate the experience of sexual assault, I didn't tell anyone. Not the doctors I saw when I became incontinent after the event. They assumed I was regressing because I was jealous of my new sibling and wanted attention, or the psychologist I saw when the problem persisted. This was my first experience with abuse, and I believe it shaped the way I responded to the trauma I experienced shortly after. What I remember most vividly is the feeling of having been invaded, the need to purge myself of that feeling, and internalizing the message that other people had the right to violate me. Not long after, when I was 6, my family hired a caretaker who I now recognize was severely mentally ill. I'll call her Cindy. She could be warm, loving, and fun. She taught me about Indian culture, lent me old Bollywood tapes, and encouraged me to pursue my childhood dream of becoming a dancer. When I was sick and home from school, she let me watch all my children with her, and we'd talk about the characters as though they were real people. Looking back, I can see how Cindy struggled with the difference between reality and fantasy. She was exceedingly superstitious, had a particular fear of demonic possession, and believed that children were susceptible to it. When you're a child, it's unnerving to hear that the devil is everywhere you turn. It is terrifying to be told that you yourself are possessed and wicked, and the person who is supposed to care for you beats you until her hands are bloodied and she hurts too much to continue. These episodes were always followed by effusive apologies, then the excuse, if You weren't so bad I wouldn't have to. And then the final warning. If anyone finds out, they will send me to India and I will die. We would enter into a period, could be weeks, could be months, where she would act once again like a loving surrogate mother. Like many who abuse children, Cindy stopped when I grew old enough to fight back. When I was 14, she died suddenly of liver cancer. My mother, sister, and I went to the morgue to identify her body. I know this sounds irrational, but I thought maybe it was possible that I had somehow contributed to her death. If only I'd been an easier child, I thought, perhaps she wouldn't have gotten sick. Less than a year later, I tried to kill myself for the first time. When you're a kid living with the fear that abuse is imminent, you become hypersensitive to social cues as a way to protect yourself. A swift gesture or an expression of irritation can be enough to send you into panic mode. I learned to be on high alert, to carefully study adults' expressions and movements to try and figure out what preceded an attack. But social signals are easy to misinterpret when you're a kid, and I found that as I got older and physical abuse was no longer a threat, I still carried the expectation that the people in my life would hurt me if I ever let down my guard. To this day, I sometimes flinch when someone steps in to hug me. My heart often races when someone puts their hand on my shoulder. Studies have shown that people with borderline personality disorder function in a state of heightened emotional arousal. When shown pictures during brain scans, our amygdalas respond to benign images and disturbing images with equal to near equal intensity. It's as though we lack emotional shock absorbers. But if you consider that around 75% of BPD sufferers have experienced trauma of some sort and understand how trauma affects our sense of personal safety, you can come to understand why we see danger even where danger may not exist. While I struggled with PTSD symptoms throughout my childhood, borderline personality disorder didn't come into my life until I turned 15. My first year of high school marked what would become a 12-year fight for my life. To my doctors, therapists, and teachers, I was a scary adolescent who simply wanted to die and, as one therapist told me, likely wouldn't make it to 21. I cut myself on a daily basis, overdosed on pills and alcohol, and talked about suicide the way one might talk about going off to college or exploring a new career. But the truth is that I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to live the way I was living, and death seemed like the only way to stop the feelings of emptiness, rage, and profound disconnection. For me, out of all the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, the worst was the chronic feeling of emptiness. It's a bit like looking into a mirror and not seeing your own reflection. Unlike other people who can describe themselves as, say, fun or clever or any other characteristic, I couldn't, and many others with BPD can't either. Without another person's personality to adopt as my own, I felt virtually non-existent. I would drift unanchored to any grounding sense of identity until I'd meet someone who made me feel connected. That person would become my one lifeline, and I would rely solely on them for emotional sustenance. These relationships were always short-lived, and their endings oftentimes preceded an overdose or a hospitalization. Looking back now, I struggle with feelings of guilt and shame over how these relationships ended and the hurt I caused. I want people who have had a negative experience with someone with BPD to know that when they lash out, when they lose control and behave in ways that are terrifying, it's not because they are malicious people. They are just doing what they think they need to do to survive. I saw a handful of mental health professionals in my teens. I'd read Girl Interrupted, looked up borderline personality disorder, and knew immediately that that was what I suffered from. Each time I would meet a new therapist, I would tell them my self-diagnosis, and they, with few exceptions, would tell me that BPD was not a label I wanted attached to my name, and that in my adolescent search for an identity, I should pick something else. Kind of, the way you would talk about a piercing or a new hair color. This one won't suit you, try another. So while I felt confident that I knew what was wrong with me, the professionals used names like bipolar 1, 2, rapid cycling, schizoaffective disorder, and even mild schizophrenia. Instead of dialectical behavioral therapy or any treatment that is proven effective for people like me, I was treated with psychodynamic talk therapy and medication, a lot of medication. By my 17th birthday, I was on a cocktail of Ritalin, a mood stabilizer, an antipsychotic, a long-acting benzodiazepine because the Ritalin made me anxious, an antidepressant, and a nightly sleeping pill. A few months after I turned 17, I was sent to a residential treatment center where I was once again misdiagnosed, this time with oppositional defiant disorder. There, some forms of physical punishment were considered acceptable, and I was pinned down and put in physical holds often until I signed myself out at 18. The 9 months I spent in an RTC, residential treatment center, is a crucial part of my story because it was there that the memories of my early trauma began to resurface. I hadn't forgotten them. I hadn't repressed them. They just did not affect me until I was once again no longer in control of my own body. I began having chronic nightmares, then flashbacks. The flashbacks grew more vivid and frightening. Physical restraint, in my opinion, should only be used to subdue someone who is trying to harm themselves or others. Centers that practice any form of corporal punishment run the risk of re-traumatizing the people in their care. My post-RTC therapist diagnosed me with borderline personality disorder. Finally, somebody got it. But she believed that, for me, trauma work was more pressing than dialectical behavioral therapy. I know this therapist had the best of intentions. She just didn't understand that for someone who suffers from profound emotional lability, treatment that relies primarily on digging into the past is worse than ineffective. It's detrimental. I began seeing a psychoanalyst 3 times a week, and my mental health deteriorated. The flashbacks grew more intense, and I began abusing alcohol to make them stop. The worse my PTSD got, the harder my analyst pushed. She believed, in strict Freudian fashion, that if I discussed my trauma history enough, I would finally free myself from the hold it had over my life. I was in analysis, talking about trauma during sessions, self-medicating with alcohol and pills, and cutting myself for almost 5 years. When I was 23, I went out drinking with a friend. We were drugged, robbed, and to this day, neither of us knows what happened during the time we were unconscious. This experience led me to Alcoholics Anonymous. Unlike analysis, AA has a structure, a strict set of guidelines, and emphasizes the importance of taking personal responsibility. While AA was not the most effective treatment for me, the more cognitive behavioral approach to treatment helped, and I felt more in control after meetings than I did after sessions of analysis. Finally, in my mid-20s, I became involved with dialectical behavioral therapy. I spent a month at a day treatment center where I had the opportunity to connect with other women and one man who also suffered from BPD. For me, being able to meet others who had a shared experience was eye-opening and changed the way I viewed my diagnosis and myself. Here I was, surrounded by people who, like me, had arguably the most stigmatized mental health disorder, and none of them represented, or resembled rather, the sociopathic villains the media portrays us as. The fatal attraction stereotype, the homicidal bunny boiler, may make for good entertainment, but is actually quite harmful to people who suffer from BPD. And when I consider the mental health professionals who are ready to diagnose me with anything and everything, I wonder how much of that fear of the term borderline personality disorder came from those media portrayals. The patients I met at the day treatment center were vibrant, smart, and deeply engaging. They all spent the majority of their mental energy trying to maintain emotional homeostasis, which, when you have BPD, feels like a full-time job. They also all had histories of childhood trauma. As I began to empathize with them, I slowly began to empathize with myself. When you have been abused by the people in your life who are supposed to look after and protect you, finding the right therapist can be a challenge. When you have trauma and BPD, it's even more challenging because the therapist needs to be someone who can gain your trust, but also someone who is experienced in working with patients who are so highly emotionally sensitive and reactive. I owe a great deal of my recovery to the fact that I kind of won the therapist jackpot, figuratively speaking. When I was 26, I began working with a DBT therapist who is actually here today in the audience. Hey. Because I was used to analysis, my instinct was to begin treatment by delving into my trauma history. Every time I would begin to talk about the abuse, my therapist would redirect me, explaining that while she acknowledged the topic needed exploring, it was important that we wait until I was more able to regulate my emotions and tolerate the pain the memories brought up. Learning skills to self-soothe and self-regulate, for me, has been a critical part of my recovery. I wouldn't be able to speak here today without them. Living with both BPD and PTSD is a moment-to-moment struggle. When you're not navigating your everyday life and the intense emotions merely existing brings up, you're living with a constant rewind or loop of painful memories. I think that trauma work is important because PTSD can make it difficult to form relationships and trust people enough to maintain those relationships. But in my experience, that work is impossible without first learning the skills needed to tolerate the pain trauma brings up. I am currently at a place in my life where I can speak about my childhood without becoming unhinged. When I am triggered, I have the tools to ground myself and regroup. Remission and recovery from BPD and PTSD is not easy, but it is possible, and it is absolutely worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next lived experience speaker is Dr. Linda Cousins, who identifies herself as a parent, a pediatrician, and a wife. She's here to speak with us about her lived experiences with her family about trauma and borderline personality disorder. We are getting our slides up and running here. You're almost got it there.
This is start connecting.
Yep.
Thanks. What is going on? All right, this is all puzzle. Oh, it's Todd's doing it.
Todd's doing it. Wow. Right. This is technology magic. Thank you, Todd. So you can advance it like this. That should work.
There we go.
There you go.
There
All
it
right.
is. All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's really a privilege to be here. My goal is to share my family's experience with borderline personality disorder, to talk about the impact of trauma in our family, and for our family that would be the non-criterion A trauma that Dr. Harnan and Dr. Williams talked about, and to explain how family connections altered our experience for the better. My plan is to explain what life was like before and during the struggles we've had, to talk about how and why family connections helped us, and to share our story since that time. In 2014, I attended this conference by myself. I didn't know anyone here. My middle child, Noah, was in a residential treatment center in Utah. I was relieved, so relieved, that she was safe and that I could wake up every day knowing that she was safe. And I was also relieved that there was peace in our house for the first time in a long time. However, Noah hadn't started to do the work of recovery yet, and she wasn't attempting to use the DBT principles, and I didn't know if she ever would. I was desperate for help. I wanted to learn something, anything, about how to help her, so I signed up for the conference. While I was at the conference, I was astounded to see health professionals who were interested in treating people with borderline personality disorder, and not only that, they wanted to learn to do it better. There were speeches by very accomplished people who were at the forefront of their field. They were passionate about teaching and about researching, and I'm sure their teaching was excellent that day. But the only people that I remember speaking were Ann and Matt Costello, who are parents of 2 adult children with borderline personality disorder and teachers of many family connections classes. By that time, my husband and I had been on the waiting list for family connections for more than a year. Ann and Matt Costello were talking about and had lived through experiences that I was experiencing. They were survivors, and they were not just survivors, but they were people who had turned back to help the people that were still drowning behind them. They were my heroes. My own family had been dealing with borderline personality disorder for quite a while, since well before we knew that there was a name for it. Andrew, who's now 23, Noah on the left is 21, and Rachel is 18. Andrew was placid and content from day one. When he was a baby, we actually thought he'd never learn to walk because he would reach for a toy, and if he couldn't reach the toy, he would kind of turn and go, ah, and just play with what he could reach. My husband used to say, this baby has no ambition. Noah was different. Noah was different in utero. She even moved differently. When I was about 7 months pregnant, I said to my husband, this baby is not like the other baby. And I was right. Once she was born, she was just the smiliest baby, and she was tons of fun. She was really feisty. She would change in an instant and be crying really hard. and she was intense. We used to say she is a round peg in a family of square holes. We were all like watercolors, all kind of muted in shades of gray, and Noah was like a Technicolor rainbow. So I had 4 copies of this and 1 copy of this. As she grew, Noah stayed intense. She was tremendously creative. She was extremely bright. She was highly social. She was also tremendously temperamental, extremely passionate, and highly reactive. This sometimes caused problems with other children. I could see Noah's emotions were getting her in trouble, so I was constantly saying, calm down, take it easy, you don't have to get so upset. And Noah herself was aware that she had big emotions. When she was in 2nd grade for health class, she had to make a folder and she had to identify something she was good at and something she needed to work on. This is the folder she made. It says, good at art, improve feelings. Through the years, we asked for help many times and in many different ways. Much like Emma said, there were numerous diagnoses. Some were accurate, some were inaccurate. Anxiety, depression, ADD. I kept asking, could she have borderline personality disorder? And they would say, no, we don't diagnose that until people are 18 years old. She may have some traits, but we don't diagnose that until people are 18 years old. And I now know that that's outdated information, that if you can, you should, because there's help. There are treatments that are very effective, as we've been talking about all day, and so much can be done to help. In middle school, Noah began to experience some trauma in the form of bullying. We had actually no idea until we witnessed it one night at a school function. Her classmates weren't aware we were watching, and it was really sickening to see. These were classmates who had been her friends. These were kids that I had had sleep over my house. We had been to sporting events together, gone to plays. And I watched as they alternately froze her out and then turned on her with their words. I've learned through my work as a pediatrician that oftentimes kids won't tell adults about the bullying they're experiencing, sometimes because they think that the adults would side with the bullies, and sometimes because they think the adults are already aware. And in our case, that's exactly what happened. We asked Noah later, why didn't you tell us you were being bullied? And she said, I thought you knew. Sometimes trauma impacts behavior and we don't have eyes to see it because we're not aware of the trauma that's happened. Suddenly it made sense why every Sunday night she had a headache or a stomach ache or both, why she was having outbursts after school. For a variety of reasons, we felt like her school wouldn't be able to ally with us in dealing with this bullying situation, so we pulled her out of the school the next week. In her new school, the public school in our town, she initially did well. She joined the drama club and she made some friends, but soon her relationships became intense and chaotic, and the wheels started falling off in all areas. By the middle of her freshman year, she was skipping classes, failing classes, ditching school altogether. There was emotional dysregulation at home. There was lying. There was a lot of self-injury. We were bringing her to therapy once a week, twice a week. There was a written plan for school, individual therapy, family therapy, meetings with teachers, meetings with guidance counselors. Those people were like my pen pals. 4 different therapists, a psychiatrist, medicine, more medicine, different medicine. We were desperately trying to connect with Noah and reel her back in, but nothing that we were doing was working. Meanwhile, our other children were suffering too, watching their sibling implode, participating in bruising interactions with Noah, and trying hard to live their life with parents who were distracted and heartsick and stretched beyond belief. There was trauma all around. One of the features of trauma is that it doesn't just affect the traumatized person, but there's collateral damage, there's a ripple effect. And for Noah at that time, and I imagine many others, they don't just absorb their distress, they pass it on. So I think of it as being more like a mirror than a cushion. Some people, because of how they were wired or the skills they've learned or the life experiences they've had, when trauma comes their way or when stress comes their way, they're like a cushion. They can absorb it a little bit without passing it on to other people. Other people are like a mirror or even like a magnifying glass. When they experience trauma or stress, they discharge it by passing it on to other people. And so the stress and distress circled around and around and around in our family. One day I caught Noah in a minor lie. It was really actually nothing compared to some of the lies. And I just had this epiphany, and I looked at her and I thought to myself, we cannot give you the help you need here at our home. And I took my laptop right then and I sat down on the couch. I didn't even know what to look for. I just started Googling like help for teen in trouble. Eventually, my search led us to people who could help us, an educational consultant who knew of some programs. This picture was taken at my son's graduation on June 13th, 2013. I don't know if you can see in it how we're all keeping our distance from Noah. No one really knew quite what to do with her by that point. The following day, she and I got on a plane to Durango, Colorado for wilderness therapy. Just prior to her departure, she came out to us as transgender, and this was new territory for us. We struggled to integrate our new understanding of Noah into our interactions. We thought about how it must be for Noah to move through the world in a body that made others misperceive her, the invalidation that must invite every day from peers, from family members, from all the people around her. Ultimately, the bottom line for us was that we wanted to be in relationship with Noah. So we resolved to learn what we needed to know about gender identity issues and do our own work and not visit our fears and weaknesses on Noah. I got clarity and realized that it's not my job to understand every decision that Noah makes. It's my job to love her. And that really became my true north. That was something that when things looked hard, I could fall back on that. I could fall back on how can I love her best. And that simplified things and made things doable and gave me courage and resilience. When Noah arrived in Durango, Colorado for wilderness therapy, we were a little bit worried. We were actually worried that she'd be able to just kind of hold it together while she was there and that people would be like, why'd you bring her here? There's nothing wrong with her. We need not have worried. In the third week, the wilderness staff called us and said, Noah needs the highest level of care. You need to find her a residential treatment center for after she graduates here. It was actually strangely validating. So we did, and 2 days after she graduated from wilderness, we brought her to a residential treatment center in Utah. While Noah was in residential, in her second summer away from us, we got the call. We had been accepted into a Family Connections program. After a year and a half, we were in the class, and what a class it was. Family Connections, as Marie Paul was saying, is a free 12-week-long group program. It's run by family members, and it provides education and skills training and support for people who are in relationship with people who are living with borderline personality disorder. Our class was taught by Marie Paul de Valdivia and Beth McCrave, both mothers of young adults with borderline personality disorder. They were able to understand what we were going through and to speak words of encouragement and teach us the skills that they too were using on a daily basis. You see, while Noah was in treatment, she was being exposed to DBT skills for self-regulating and for communicating, and we were not. Family Connections was our chance to learn those skills and to practice them. Marie Paul now remembers me as shell-shocked, and that would be accurate. I was definitely quiet in the group. I was taking it all in, but I was not confident enough to participate in the role plays or the conversations for the most part. However, on my own time, I was participating almost nonstop. I was using my skills on grocery store clerks, on my patients, on their parents, on my other family members, and I was finding out that, wow, these skills really work. Family Connections was also our chance to be supported in our grief, in our confusion, and in our efforts at resilience. We had thought that we were alone. We didn't know anyone in our lives or in our community that was going through something like this. Our friends' kids were going to prom, getting their driver's licenses, applying to college, graduating. They didn't know how to talk to us about what we were going through, and we didn't know how to talk with them. Family Connections was a place that we could be with people who got it. It was so life-giving that I started to talk about it to our therapist at the residential treatment center, and the school ultimately sent 3 of their therapists to be trained in Family Connections, and they now do teleconnections. And they also teach Family Connections principles to people who are to the parents of their students who are on the waiting list for Family Connections. So fast forward to today. As I mentioned, in December of 2014, Noah graduated from the residential treatment program in Utah and came home to us. And we were ready because we had completed Family Connections in September of 2014. By the time Noah came home, we all had some skills, some DBT principles, and that was really helpful because we had 3 teenagers at home. We spent the next months and years healing together, rebuilding trust, and creating positive memories to build on. Noah is amazing, and today she is very, very healthy. She's healed her relationships with us. She has a number of close friends. She was married in July, and she has a strong relationship with her husband. She's just finishing her junior year in college, and she's a supervisor at her job. I live in Upton, Massachusetts. It's about 2 miles from the starting line of the Boston Marathon. And Marathon Monday, also known as Patriots Day in Massachusetts, is a very big deal. And it's not an uncommon thing for people from our area to run in the marathon, and I have actually a surprising number of friends who have. One of them was telling me about her experience running the Boston Marathon. And she said, when you're in the Boston Marathon, the Kenyans, the elite runners at the front of the pack, they're amazing, but they're not the people that keep you going. The people that keep you going are the people that are a few steps ahead of you. For us, the people a few steps ahead of us were our leaders and Family Connections. I'll always be grateful that they took time out during their own challenging and stressful parenting experiences to turn back and give us skills and give us hope. So, having walked this path and still being on the journey, I have a few things to say to each of you who are here today. For professionals working with families, I would like to say this is life-changing work you're doing. I know this because my life and my daughter's life and my family's life were changed by people just like you. The family is your patient too. Point the family toward help. For parents and for family members who are attending this conference today, listening through a haze of grief and trauma, I would like to say there is hope. There is so much hope. There's a huge amount of hope. You can do anything you need to do for your family member. You already have. You found your way here, and there's hope in these principles and in these people. This is a hard path we're on, but you can do it. For people who live with borderline personality disorder, I would like to say, borderline personality disorder is a living agony. I know because I saw it with my daughter. But so much is now known, and DBT is such an effective treatment, and by the way, can help you, like as if it's a superpower, can help you deal with people. Do the work, stick with the work, find a therapist and stick with him or her. As a physician, I can tell you that there's a remission rate that's so high that I wish that there was a remission rate like that for diabetes or for most kinds of cancer. In closing, I would like to say thank you to all of you for being here, for doing this work, and for listening to my story.